Okay, we talked before about why the U.S. had not bothered to get into the war in Europe up until now. And it's because nobody in the United States wanted any part of it, or the French or the Italians, or the British for that matter. We were at the time, we just didn't want to be around anywhere directly on our land. It didn't affect us at all, so we didn't want to pay any attention to it. Roosevelt in particular, President Roosevelt, he knew we were going to have to get into it sooner or later. It was the only question of when, because if Hitler was able to knock off Russia and England, he's already Europe, as well as Finland, and only a couple of countries that were countries that were countries that didn't take sides either way. They remained independent. But Roosevelt knew we were going to have to do something, and so he started quietly moving the area of defense mechanisms towards a wartime status. So by 1941, of course, the beginnings of 1941, it became evident that we were going to really have to do something, and things started moving along more rapidly. We were funneling tons of money to the Allies to help them in the fight before we got involved. Called the Lend-Lease Act. That is, we've lent them huge amounts of money, equipment, aircraft, tanks, trucks, almost everything you could think of that would help them in war. We loaned to them. And so as a result, they were starting to at least get to the point where they didn't feel as hopeless as they normally would. And all that did was set the stage for the fact that we were going to wind up getting involved in the war directly. So nearing the end of 1941, the pressure was on to really get going in the wartime atmosphere. So a lot of things were going on in the United States. And actually turned out to be beneficial because in the United States we were doing things that would help us for the rest of the history of the country. For example, the whole air traffic control system was vastly improved in that short a period of time, and had it not been for the warmongers in Europe, we might very well have even today have a more antiquated air traffic control system. Matthew. This is still World War II. Yes. So here we are building airports, building an air traffic control system, and at the same time giving orders to companies like Lockheed and North American to start building fighter planes. So in a strange way, the advent of World War II in Europe helped the United States in its civilian activities. Andrew? Pardon? Fresno, what now? Ask me the question again. It's what?
Fresno Air Terminal.
What about Fresno Air Terminal?
When was it built?
Huh?
When was it built?
When was it built?
Yes.
It was built before World War II, yeah. It was called Hammer Field. It was operated by the Army Air Force, even before the Air Force became a separate defense structure. So that was a long time ago. At the time, that was back in the 30s, and at the time, Fresno Chandler was the big airport. It had a control tower. It had commercial flights in and out of there. And Chandler was actually inaugurated in 1935. So it was a commercial airport. So if you wanted to go to Fresno, you flew into Fresno Chandler, which is about a mile southwest of the downtown area. So a lot of things were happening in Europe that helped us out here locally. You know, that's one of those things where what it takes is, it takes some unusual activity worldwide in order to make sure that things happen in this country a lot faster than they would under any other bureaucracy. You can imagine how long it would have taken to build new airports, improve existing airports, build an air traffic control system faster than we would have otherwise. It would have probably taken 10 years. In that case, it probably took less than 10 months, certainly a month or two just to get started doing that. So here we are taking advantage of the war in Europe. We don't want any part of it. We don't want to be involved over there. We don't want any of our people killed over there. And yet, all the preparations that were going on in our country benefited us in civilian life. So it was an interesting time for the United States, and it was only a question of what were we thinking that might trigger our involvement in World War II. You know, nobody was going to stand up and say, okay, now's the time, I think we should go over there and declare war. That didn't happen. It didn't happen. So, in the meantime, while we were waiting to see who was going to define our activity in World War II, Hitler was having his own problems with Russia. That was one of those things where no one ever counts on Mother Nature to have an enormous effect on the outcome of any conflict. And yet here's what happened in Russia, and it's been shown, movies have been shown on television probably for the last 50 years about how bad it was in Russia. The German soldiers were just freezing in place. They were dying by the thousands because they were sitting there. They didn't have the right overcoats. They couldn't manufacture overcoats fast enough because war material was being used instead of manufacturing overcoats. They were freezing in place. So it's amazing, huh? You go to war and you freeze to death instead of getting shot. I suppose maybe freezing is a better way to do it, but anyway, the point is that it was a terrible winter for the Germans, and it was a good winter for the Russians. The Russians thought they were going to count on that, and actually it happened. Jacob.
Isn't the USSR and the Soviets the same?
Yeah, USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. Russia is the major country, part of USSR. The other countries were like the Ukraine and Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, yeah. Those are the countries that were part of the Soviet Socialist Republic. But Russia was the biggest country. So when the USSR collapsed, what was left were the Russians and their own country, and then all these other independent countries, including, for example, Ukraine. I think you're more familiar with Ukraine than you would be some of the other countries. So it was a terrible winter. Anyway, the Soviets realized that even though they lost huge numbers of airplanes, they counted on the U.S. to send them more airplanes. But, of course, they couldn't send it through Europe, so they had to send it through a place called Al-Sib, which was... Pardon? What was that, Eduardo? Hold on. Relax. Yes, you may. I think in that case you would have been justified to get up and start walking towards... Okay, so one of the problems was how do we get the aircraft into Russia if the entire European continent is taken up by Hitler? And of course we sent it up through Alaska, across the Bering Strait, and down into Russia. So all these aircraft were flown. In the meantime, the United States set up regiments of soldiers at different spots along the way to make sure that the aircraft could land, be refueled, have the pilots rest, and then continue on. That's a long flight. That was my young student's flight coming back. He didn't come up through the Bering Strait, but he went from Japan to the Aleutian Islands, which is almost as bad. Not quite as far north, but I think it's actually worse in many ways. So there were ferry routes that were open to getting supplies into Russia to help them in their fight against the Germans. Remember, I don't want you to take detailed notes. What I want you to do is the same way you would do if you were going to be reading a book of history. That is, you read a paragraph and you say to yourself, okay, what's the important concept in that paragraph? How do I feel about what I just read? Is it important to me as I continue to read? Now, your problem, of course, is you're not sure what's important to you versus what's important to me. But that's always the case whenever you're taking a course. There's always a sort of an unwritten conflict between what the professor thinks is important versus what the student thinks is important. But I think in this case, you'll get a pretty good idea if you try not to write down word for word. Your best bet is to get a feeling of each paragraph. What does that mean in the overall scheme of things? You know, it's not necessarily that I'm going to ask you a question about P-39s and P-63s. I won't, because it wasn't critical at that time, the exact model of aircraft. All I want you to remember is that we helped Russia by sending aircraft up over the globe and into Russia so that they could defend themselves against the Germans. Okay. So, in the Pacific War, here's Japan coming along, and they started attacking British territories in the Far East. And then for reasons which have already been defined in many, many books, they decided to attack the United States on December 7th, 1941. Does everybody know what Pearl Harbor is? Do you know where it's located? In Hawaii? What island? Oahu. Oahu is a small island in the chain of Hawaiian islands, but it's the one where Honolulu is located. It's the one where that their very, very famous beach is located, right? And that's the place where normally everybody goes first, because that's where the remnants of the target ships have been located, or the ships that were sunk. So this was the trigger for World War II, to get the United States involved. Immediately after we were bombed in Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt got on the air the next day and said, that's it, we're declaring war against Japan, Germany, and whoever else, right? So here we were drifting through 1941, and by drifting through 1941, nobody had any idea when we were going to finally get involved in the war in Europe, and Japan made that decision for us, didn't they? Yeah. So by bombing Pearl Harbor, it turns out that they certainly did a favor for France and England and the rest of the countries that have been occupied by the Germans. What's interesting, and that is that the carriers, the aircraft carriers that were supposed to be in Hawaii at the time, had gone to sea, all of them. And I think there was one old type carrier that was still in Pearl Harbor, but it wasn't a significant aircraft carrier. Anyway, they were all at sea. And because the Japanese launched from carriers, they knew that carriers were going to be the ultimate weapon of war. And here they arrive in Hawaii, and they're bombing all these big battleships, which really didn't mean anything, and cruisers and destroyers. And what they were really after were the aircraft carriers. What's unfortunate is that later on in the war, the carriers turned out to be the deciding factor in our blasting Japan in a naval way, and then, of course, threatening to invade Japan near the end of the war. Pardon? I'm sorry, what was that? Atomic bomb? Yeah, well, that comes a little later, I think, huh? All right, so in the meantime, now we're preparing for war. Now everybody knows we're going to go to war, and it was interesting because the movie reels, the movie theaters show that we are in a situation where we're volunteering, we're all volunteering to go to war. All the young men wound up at the draft board wanting to enlist in the Army so that they could go fight the Germans, or the Japanese, as it were. Trouble is, by the time they got in the middle of combat and they saw how brutal and vicious and savage it was, they were no longer quite as thrilled to have joined the fight against the Germans or the Japanese. The realities of war made anyone sober at that point in time. So, as you can see, there were things going on fairly rapidly. I want you to get a sense of not necessarily these individual activities. I just want you to get a sense that all of a sudden, everybody in the United States paid attention to getting ready for war. They stopped making civilian automobiles. They stopped making sewing machines. They stopped making ironing boards and refrigerators and stoves and all the things in a household that would be used containing metal of any sort, mostly steel. They literally stopped using and turned those raw materials towards the defense effort. So just keep in mind that these 6 things here are simply going to tell you in your notes that the United States was massing for war in all phases of the life here in this country. I happen to know one of the WASPs, Women Army Service Brothers. She was the wife of a good friend of mine, a man who bought a few airplanes from me when I had the facility in Burbank. She lived in La Cañada, just north of Burbank. And she flew all of those aircraft all during the war. Those women pilots flew those aircraft everywhere. They flew them to Alaska. They flew them to across the country, because majority of them were built here in the western United States, right? They were built in Santa Monica. They were built in Long Beach. They were built in Seattle, Washington. And so these girls, young girls, were trained as pilots and started flying these fighter planes as well as the big bombers. And they were delivering them all over the place. They were delivering to, for example, they would deliver a B-25 from California all the way to Norfolk, Virginia, where they would be loaded on a ship and transported over to Europe. And so at the end of the war, they just said, okay, go home and be a housewife. Well, at that point in time, the women didn't want to be just a housewife. They wanted to be pilots. They wanted to continue their career as pilots. They could have easily joined the airlines. Well, the trouble is that after the war, you had all these other pilots coming out, men, and they pushed the women out of the way and took the jobs that the women had and made the women go home and work at home. Not a really good chapter in the relation between men and women at that point in time. Okay, so as far as the military research and development and production is concerned, helicopters did play an important part, but I can tell you that if you look up history books, you're not going to get a lot of information about the role that helicopters played in the early part of the war. They were there. There was a lot of development going on. They might have been transporting generals from one office to another. They might even have been used in the battlefield, although that's probably pretty sketchy in terms of the numbers that were used, because there weren't that many being built, and they were kind of crude in the first place. You can see some of these little helicopters we have out there. They almost look rickety in many ways. Of course, what we have today. Those were the kind of things that were being built in the 41s. I'm not sure when this one was being built. Jacob?
Helicopters skyrocketed until
In Vietnam, yeah, but we're talking about, Vietnam's a long way from World War II. You're right. There's no question that the most widely used aircraft in all of Vietnam was the helicopter, the Huey, or the Black Hawk later on. So the words Sikorsky, Young, Bell, and Hiller, those were men who made their fortunes and their names in helicopter development and design and production. It was a useful aircraft, but I don't think it was as useful as history makes it out to be. So, jet engines. The question is, who developed the first jet engine? And as it turns out, the British. A British guy by the name of Frank Whittle, who wrote a thesis. He was attending the Royal Air Force Academy. It was sort of like the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs in this country. It was a university for Air Force people. So he He applied and was accepted at the Royal Air Force Academy, and during that time at the Academy, he wrote a thesis on the development of aircraft designs, and in there he suggested that maybe there'd be a way to develop a completely unique new engine that would have almost no moving parts except the fan blade, the turbine part of it, compressor part. And so he went ahead and he left. He finally got out, graduated, and went into active civilian service, started his own company, and began working on his jet engine. So if you look back that far, Frank Whittle was probably the father of the jet engine. However, at the time, and early on in Germany, Germans were developing their own jet engine. This German here, Hans von Ohain of Germany, his idea was very similar, a little bit different. So what happened was Whittle found out about it, Ohain found out about Whittle. They started combining their two ideas to come up with what essentially is today's jet engine. So now, do most of you know that these giant engines, these huge engines that are bigger than my wingspan, if you stand inside of them, that it's a small jet engine with a big fan, right? You know that, right? And so most of the thrust doesn't come from the engine. You all know that, right? Okay? Most of the thrust comes from the fact that that small jet engine drives these huge fan blades, this gigantic fan that you can see turning as you look at inside a jet engine. You can see that turning. That is just connected to the jet engine. It's the jet engine that provides the movement of the fan, but it's the fan that rams the air through. So it's picking pure air and ramming pure air through. The fact that the air is going around the jet engine means that it's cooling the jet engine, but at the same time, it's keeping the noise down. So American Airlines was the first to adopt the fan jet engine, and they made a big deal of it nationwide. Of course, I remember because I was there. They made a big deal of it on their advertisements to fly American Airlines because they had fan jets which were more powerful, used less fuel, and were quieter. So when you look at these giant engines on board these commercial airliners, those engines are small jets driving huge fans. So it was a combination of a lot of Whittle and Ohain's technology, but the fact is that later on in, I believe, around the late 60s or early 70s is when the fan jet engine was introduced. I believe it was introduced by Pratt & Whitney, but probably all three of them, United Aircraft, Pratt & Whitney, Rolls-Royce, and GE, who all made jet engines, all quickly got to the idea that, hey, it's better if we have a jet engine driving a fan than it would be just the jet engine, the pure jet engine. And you remember the pictures that I showed in the early part of this semester where there was thick black smoke coming out of the engines of a commercial airliner as it was taking off. Well, that thick black smoke was directly as a result of that was just the engine itself. So later on, when they built the fan around the engine, they were able to cut down on that smoke because they of course, improved the fuel. They improved the way it burned inside of the jet engine. And, of course, then the fan also helped because with more power came absolutely no more pollution from the jet engine. Rockets. Wernher von Braun was kidnapped by the United States right after World War II. They went over there, and they knew they had to get a hold of him before the Russians did. They literally grabbed him, put him on an aircraft, and very quietly and at night flew him out of the country over to the United States. He is the guy responsible for the whole Apollo program that led to landing on the moon. He was put in charge of our ballistic missile development. So in this particular case, there were two, the V-1 and the V-2. They were very different. The V-1 was like a drone with a jet engine. It had wings, it had a tail surface, it had a jet engine on it, it had a bomb charge on the front of it. and it would be flown across the English Channel, and it would make a buzzing noise, and when it got over London, everybody could hear it. So when it got over London, all of a sudden the engine cut out. And as they knew that once that engine cut out, they had a few seconds before it would fall and the explosion would blow something up. And that kept on constantly. They were sending thousands of these V-1 buzz bombs, they called them, over London to just blow up anything. They were killing civilians. They were blowing up cathedrals. They were blowing up office buildings. Sometimes they'd get lucky and blow up a bridge, but not very often. But the V-2 was truly the world's first ballistic missile. It was a gigantic piece of equipment that was probably 4 or 5 times as big as the V-1, and it was a ballistic missile. So Germany had made significant advances in rocketry at the time, and unfortunately for London, that was the case. Ultimately, they wound up being able to get to a site called Peenemünde, which is a rocket launching site in Germany. Fortunately, I had a chance to visit Peenemünde because when I was in the service, we were making trips up to the Baltic Sea and firing our 90-millimeter aircraft guns at drones. People were flying drones at that time. So the Western or European theater essentially had 3 fronts that they were dealing with. And if you can imagine what Europe looked like, Hitler's looking east and he sees Russia. Then he's looking south and he sees the Mediterranean. And then he's looking west and he sees the United States and Britain and the remnants of people in France ready to do him in. So he actually found himself in a very difficult position because he wanted to be able to fight one front at a time. But because he overrode his general's advice on so many occasions that he was the one that got himself in trouble. And then, of course, he'd blame a general or two and have him executed because they weren't following his orders or some crazy thing like that. He was really a brutal, deranged individual, in my opinion. So the Western Air War then was faced with 3 separate fronts. But by that time, the United States was producing so many fighter and bomber aircraft by the thousands. Every month, thousands of aircraft would roll off the assembly line in the United States and be sent over to England, or they would be sent to Africa, or when we finally got in and conquered Italy, they would be sent to southern Italy. So the 3 fronts are important. Southern front, okay, the Western Air War. The Eastern Front was between Germany and Russia. By that time, Russia had kicked all the Germans out, and they were now starting to advance on and through Poland and Romania, heading towards the German soil. Just remember, there were 3 fronts. There was a front to the south, the east, and the west. To the north of Germany was nothing. It was the Baltic Sea, and then north of the Baltic Sea was Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Norway. And those were generally countries that didn't want to get involved in the fighting. Finland got overrun because of the fact that Germany thought that they had a couple of pieces of territory that Germans originally felt they belonged to them, so they went into Finland and obliterated them for a while. Okay, so let's talk about the Southern Front briefly. Most of the Southern Front occurred in Africa, North Africa, Libya, Egypt, in that area. And there was one individual who was not named usually, except there was a movie made of him called The Desert Fox, and his name was Rommel, R-O-M-M-E-L. And it's a great movie. If you ever want to see a movie about World War II in North Africa, it's called The Desert Fox. And Erwin Rommel was the brilliant German tactician who ultimately was executed by Hitler because Hitler didn't like what he was doing. So Hitler brought him back to Berlin, and then we don't know for sure if he was forced to take a poison pill or whether he was shot or hanged, but normally those guys are either shot or they have to take a poison pill. But he was so bright that he kept that war going for a long time in North Africa before the British, and then with the help of the Americans, finally went in and took over. But we had some terrible trouble with aviation in North Africa, you can imagine, because remember a couple lectures ago, we showed some of the early combat aircraft in World War I were landing in the desert, and they were flying in and around North Africa. They were running into all kinds of trouble with sand getting into the engine or into the gas tanks. So the airplanes that were used most in the southern area were the B-17s, the 25s, and the 24s. You don't have to remember that. It's not critical that you remember the specific numbers. Just remember that even though we sent fighters, the B-17s and the B-25s and the B-24s were multi-engine bomber aircraft. There were not a lot of fighters used over there except the P-40, but in fact, in the final analysis, as I show there, the aircraft played only a limited role in the victory in North Africa. It was mostly done by trucks and tanks. And that's the way Rommel fought. Rommel fought with trucks and tanks, and we and the British defeated him with trucks and tanks. Everybody know where the island of Sicily is? Okay. Sicily is a fairly large island just off the toe of the boot that Italy looks like. Italy looks like a big boot with a toe and a heel. And Sicily is located just off the toe of the Italian mainland, across which is called the Messina Strait, Messina, the Messina Strait. We went into Sicily and spent a lot of time killing a lot of Germans in Sicily until we finally took over. We finally conquered Sicily, gathered all the German prisoners of war, and now we could relax a little bit. So then from there, we decided, okay, now we're going to launch ourselves onto the Italian mainland, and that was from there then, instead of just going right across the Messina Strait to the toe of Italy, they decided to go up the coast towards Naples and land just south of Naples in an area called Salerno. Not cookies, not crackers. But Salerno is the name of a town, and south of Salerno is where we landed. So that was a good move too, because once we got there, now we could have bases in southern Italy. Right, Nico? Good, I'm glad you got that last one. So once we got onto the Italian mainland, we could take aircraft and we could fly them over Germany and return and not even worry about fuel or about length of the trip. On the Western Front, that was a different story. The Western Front was where everything was happening, because that was where anybody familiar with the Tuskegee Airmen? Okay. Very, very famous black airmen. You know, it was one of the sad things that at the time, the people who were responsible for the Army or all of the defense forces felt that the Negroes were not smart enough or not courageous enough to do anything in war. Every once in a while, somebody would come along and say, "Now, wait a minute, I'm going to try these guys out in these airplanes and see." Well, sure enough, they were as good or better than anybody else. And that's, unfortunately, the way things happened in the world of the Negro back in the early part of 1940. 1940s, sad to say. Okay, so on the Western Front, we're talking about the fact that... Pardon? Okay. So on the Western Front, we're talking about the fact that we're battling out over the Atlantic. The U-boats are still destroying convoy shipping. But we discovered that if we got airplanes in the air, we could see these U-boats below the surface. And I talked about this a couple lectures ago, where a U-boat could not stay underwater very long, 30 minutes or maybe an hour at most, and it had to surface to recharge its batteries and the oxygen on board. Not true any longer of our nuclear submarines that can stay submerged for 6 months at a time or more. I think they could probably stay submerged for a year if they want to. With the nuclear system on board, they generate their own oxygen from the water. They take the oxygen right out of the water and create fresh air inside the nuclear subs. So, and then shipping and convoy, they certainly had convoys, but that was only with air cover. Otherwise, shipping and a convoy meant that all the submarines had to do was just wait for these massive numbers of ships coming through in a convoy and fire almost blindly. So here we are in the middle of the war, and we are getting blasted by the German U-boat. In the meantime, along comes a young man by the name of Alan Turing. And Alan Turing was the father of the modern computer. If you want to see a movie that is very, very fascinating, and it's fairly recent, maybe within the last 2 years or so, called The Imitation Game, I would suggest that if you have access to getting a movie or to going to see that movie somewhere, or at least downloading it, The Imitation Game is about Alan Turing's efforts to develop a machine that would decode the German Enigma machine. The German Enigma machine was a machine that was designed by the Germans to encode all of their messages sent around the world. But more importantly, messages that were sent to the Luftwaffe and to the U-boat submarines. So Alan Turing was successful. They were able to finally decode every message that came through from the Germans, so they knew exactly where the Germans were sending these U-boats to wait for the convoys. They knew exactly where they were, what time they were going to arrive, how long they were going to be there, how many U-boats were going to be stationed in that spot. So you can imagine, with that kind of information, the ability now to blow them out of the water was at their taking. So the number of ships that were sunk almost went to nothing, because the number of U-boats and full crews were destroyed in the water. There are probably thousands of U-boats along with their crews laying on the bottom of the North Atlantic. And that's a result of Alan Turing, a young man who suffered a great deal because of the terrible attitude of everyone in the world, not just England, but everyone in the world, towards gay men. He was gay, and they treated him so badly that here's the hero, one of the heroes of World War II, being treated that way. So instead, he winds up being arrested, being fined, it's something too really sad to even contemplate after what he did to save the war and to save us from the U-boat pack. Okay, guys, enough conversation. This happens to be one of the boats that was developed to be used around the world, and used for the shipping as well, to go out over the North Atlantic. This was the Catalina, very, very well known because it used to be able to land out in the open ocean and pick up naval flyers who had to ditch their aircraft over the ocean. They probably saved, who knows, thousands and thousands of airmen that had themselves shot down for whatever reason, wound up in the water, and they saved those men's lives. So this was an enormous benefit, a great aircraft, because it was so well equipped to work on the ocean. And there are a couple still flying around the United States today. They have been bought and restored, and they are sometimes at air shows. Certainly you can go back east to some of the places where they're located. I think like maybe Texas, I think, has one of them, the Commemorative Air Force. Bombing in Europe. During the war, all kinds of inventions trying to figure out a way of stopping the enemy from taking advantage of whatever you have, whatever you don't want to give them. In the case of the British, they were working hard to figure out how to do a better job of bombing Germany, because now they were free to do that. There were no more German efforts to bomb or strafe or do anything to England. England was free at that point in time to be able to do what they wanted to. They also developed a bit of chaff. Everybody knows what chaff is. They're small pieces of thin metal that are thrown out the back of an airplane, and that confuses the radar. It also confuses in dogfighting, in a dogfighting area where if your opponent tries to lock on your radar, if you get rid of a lot of chaff behind the aircraft, the radar gets confused and can't figure out whether it needs to lock onto the chaff or lock onto your metal airplane. So they developed that in World War II. They also developed radar, by the way. That was the British again. The British developed radar. Again, one of the developments, we talked about this before, I mentioned it in one of my earlier lectures, in something called the Norden bomb sight. And the Norden bomb sight was extremely valuable because it was so accurate, no matter what altitude you were at, no matter how high you were flying, no matter what kind of day it was, with strong winds or not, or turbulence, the bomb sight would take account of all of that, and the bomb sight would tell you when to release the bombs, given that it would take exactly a certain number of seconds for the bombs to fall and what direction and how they would be affected by the wind. It was so valuable that it was never out of the sight of any human being, ever, and usually locked in cases that were chained to the wrist of some officer in the Air Force at the time. Those bomb sights were never left in any of the bombers. They were taken out immediately after the bomber landed, and they were brought into a secure place, and then only when those bombers were getting ready to go did the men walk out with those locked cases, unlock them, install the bomb sight, and then let the airplane go.
So what would happen if they got shot down?
Well, that's a problem. And one of the things that they were trained to do if they got shot down was to set off a grenade or something that would destroy the bomb sight in the aircraft. I don't really remember any conversations where they got a hold of the Norden bomb sight. I'm not familiar with that area. That might be something for some of you to work on. So with the Norden bomb sight, they could do daylight bombing and nighttime bombing and whatever they wanted at that point in time. Let's see how far along we are here. Okay, we're right at the end. I know, congratulations. So, at night, with the information, with the radar they developed night fighters. This is a Black Widow night fighter, P-61. And it was modified with huge radar domes in the nose, and they were able to spot the German fighters who had no way of telling who they were because they didn't fly with lights on. They flew completely in the dark. So a lot of German aircraft were shot down by these P-61s because the German aircraft had no idea that they were being chased or being locked on by another aircraft. And it was extremely effective for a long, long time. They couldn't figure out what was going on. I think at some point in time the Germans might have decided to do that chaff thing, but even so, before that they lost enough to make it worthwhile. Okay, we'll go here till 2:15 and we'll take a 10-minute break. Okay, so as the P-51 came on in greater numbers, it turns out that P-51 is really one of the great inventions of World War II, one of the great aircraft designs. The P-47 and the P-51 made all the difference in the world in fighter aircraft. And today, you'd have to pay $1.5 million more for a restored P-51. That's what it looks like. And at every air show, line for the P-51, and it has an extremely beautiful sounding engine. It's a Rolls-Royce Merlin. It's called the Merlin Rolls-Royce engine, V12 or some ridiculous 4,000 horsepower or some crazy thing. But it's an extremely smooth engine. As it zooms overhead at an air show, you can tell instantly that one aircraft is a P-51. It sounds like no other fighter aircraft ever built. And its speeds were upwards of 400 miles an hour. In the Eastern Front, it was not much going on because the Russians finally started pushing the Germans back out. They invaded Germany and then went on from there. The Germans actually had a jet fighter called the Me-262, and it's just too bad that in that particular case, for the Germans, if they had made more of those earlier enough, they probably would have had a bit of an effect. But we really overwhelmed the war in Europe by the sheer numbers of fighters and trucks and tanks and bombers that were being produced by all the factories in the United States. In the Pacific Air War, the one hero of the Pacific Air War is Jimmy Doolittle, who very early after Pearl Harbor taught his guys who were flying B-25 twin-engine bombers how to fly off an aircraft carrier, went to Japan, dropped their bombs, and then, of course, ran out of fuel because they couldn't carry that much fuel, and they wound up in China. Most of them were not captured. Some of them were captured by the Japanese, but most got free and came back to the United States. And then at the bottom of this, of course, the atomic bomb ends the war. There's no question about the fact that the atomic bomb had to be used. Thousands of the time it was dropped. If it had not been dropped, the Japanese, who were already preparing for a slaughter, they were going to have all the men, women, and children in the country ready to fight if the United States or any other allies came ashore in Japan, whether it was Tokyo or wherever else. There would have been hundreds of thousands of people killed on both sides of the war in Japan if those bombs had not been dropped. So you say to yourself, there were all kinds of people saying at the time, oh, what a terrible thing. The bomb was dropped on Japan. Yeah, but the alternative was something else. So here's the P-47. Here's the Corsair that was used by Pappy Boyington in his flying. And here's the B-29 that dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that was the end of World War II, thankfully. Yeah, I agree. I agree. Okay, that's it. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. Yeah. Yeah, don't forget to be back here at 2:38. Pardon? Yeah. Where? Yeah. Yeah.
Can I go outside?
Pardon?
What time do we come back?
2:38. No, 2:28. I'm sorry. 2:28. Spread the word, Francisco. I'm a little messed up there.